Hello there. You're listening to The Planet's Memory, where time breathes and the Earth remembers. Beneath your feet right now, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and prepare to drift into dreams, there exists a world that humanity has whispered about for thousands of years, a world carved into stone and shadow, where ancient civilizations may have walked through corridors lit by torches that burned with secrets we can barely comprehend today. Tonight, we invite you on a journey that will carry you downward, deep into the earth, where the boundaries between myth and reality blur like mist rising from underground rivers that have never seen the sun. This is not a story of fantasy, though it may sound like one. This is a story about the persistent legends, the archaeological discoveries, the geological mysteries, and the human longing to believe that beneath the surface of our ordinary world lies something extraordinary, something that our ancestors knew and protected, something that might still be waiting in the darkness below. Close your eyes and imagine descending through layers of time and stone, through the familiar world above into chambers and tunnels that stretch for miles, into cities that were built when the stars shone in different patterns, into a legacy that challenges everything we think we know about human history. Tonight, you will not simply fall asleep. Tonight, you will journey into the depths of the greatest mystery that lies directly beneath us all. The story of the underground world begins not with modern discovery, but with ancient memory, with tales told around fires in the earliest days of human civilization. When our ancestors looked not only to the skies, but also to the depths below their feet, and wondered what secrets the earth might hold. Long before we had the technology to explore the ocean floor or send rockets into space, humans were digging into the earth, creating tunnels and chambers for shelter, for worship, for burial, and perhaps for reasons we have not yet understood. These early excavations were not random. They followed patterns that suggest knowledge of geology, of water systems, of air circulation, of structural integrity that seems impossibly advanced for the time periods in which they were created. In every corner of the ancient world, from the Americas to Asia, from Europe to Africa, cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another all share strikingly similar legends about beings who lived beneath the surface, about vast cavern systems that connected distant lands, about sacred underground spaces where the gods themselves walked among mortals. These are not isolated stories. They form a tapestry of belief that spans the entire human experience, suggesting that perhaps these legends emerge not from imagination alone, but from something our ancestors actually encountered, something they tried to preserve in story and song for generations to come. The oldest texts we possess, inscribed on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls that crumble at the gentlest touch, speak of realms beneath the earth with a consistency that makes skeptics pause and wonder. The Sumerians, who gave us some of the first written language, described an underworld called Kur, which was not merely a place of the dead, but an actual physical realm beneath the mountains, accessible through specific caves and passages that the brave or foolish might enter. Their texts describe journeys into this darkness, encounters with beings who ruled these subterranean domains, and the peculiar qualities of this underground world where time moved differently, and the laws of the surface no longer applied. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, includes detailed descriptions of the hero's journey into the underworld, through tunnels that stretched for 12 leagues in complete darkness, before emerging into gardens lit by jewels that glowed with their own inner light. Modern readers dismiss these descriptions as poetic metaphor, but the ancient Sumerians made clear distinctions between their mythological stories and their historical records. And these accounts of the underground world appear in texts that they themselves classified as factual descriptions of real places. Moving forward through time and across geography, we encounter the ancient Egyptians with their elaborate beliefs about the Duat, the underworld through which the sun god Ra travelled each night, battling serpents and demons before emerging triumphant at dawn. Egyptian texts describe this realm with architectural precision, detailing halls and chambers, lakes of fire, and gates guarded by specific deities. The pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead provide maps of this territory, guidebooks for the deceased to navigate its dangers. While scholars interpret these as spiritual allegories, the level of detail suggests the descriptions may have been based on actual underground complexes that the Egyptians knew existed and perhaps had explored. The presence of vast tunnel systems beneath the Giza Plateau, some mapped and many still unexplored, lends credence to the possibility that the Duat was not entirely fictional, but rather a mythologized version of real subterranean spaces that held deep religious and cultural significance. The Egyptians were master builders who understood stone and earth with profound sophistication. When they described elaborate underground chambers, they were describing something they knew how to create. The ancient Greeks contributed their own detailed accounts of underground realms through the myths of Hades. The kingdom of the dead reached through specific caves and chasms scattered throughout the Greek landscape. The entrance at Cape Taenarum in southern Greece, the cave at Cumae in Italy where the Sibyl dwelt, and the Oracle Cave at Delphi all served as recognized portals to the underworld in Greek tradition. These were not abstract concepts, but actual locations that Greeks could visit, places where the boundary between the living world and the realm below grew thin. The myth of Orpheus descending into Hades to retrieve his beloved Eurydice describes a journey through tunnels and across underground rivers with such geographic specificity that some scholars have attempted to map the route based on real cave systems in ancient Thrace. Plato, in his dialogue about Atlantis, mentions vast underground channels and caverns beneath the Earth's surface, describing them not as mythical constructs, but as natural features of the planet's structure that influence the flow of waters and the emergence of springs. The Greek philosophers, who prided themselves on reason and observation, took the existence of extensive underground spaces as an accepted fact of natural science. In the ancient Hindu texts of India, the underworld takes on multiple forms across different layers, each more mysterious than the last. The Puranas describe Patala, a realm of 7 subterranean levels beneath the earth, each inhabited by different beings including the Nagas, serpent people of great wisdom and power who possess gems that could illuminate the darkness without fire. These texts describe underground cities of magnificent beauty, built with architecture surpassing anything on the surface, places where treasures beyond measure lay guarded by beings whose lifespans stretched for thousands of years. The level of architectural detail in these descriptions, including the materials used, the dimensions of the chambers, and the sophisticated systems for air and water, suggests the authors were describing something more concrete than pure fantasy. Ancient Indian tradition holds that certain cave systems in the Himalayas provide access to these deeper realms, and that yogis and mystics sometimes disappeared into these passages seeking the wisdom of the Nagas, occasionally returning with knowledge that seemed to transcend normal human understanding. The consistency of these accounts across thousands of years of Indian literature creates a narrative continuity that many scholars find difficult to dismiss as mere mythology. The indigenous peoples of the Americas preserved their own traditions of underground worlds, often describing them as places of origin from which their ancestors emerged into the light of the surface world. The Hopi people speak of the Sipapuni, the hole in the earth through which humanity climbed from the previous world into this one, passing through several underground levels before reaching the surface. Their traditions describe these lower worlds in detailed terms, explaining the challenges their ancestors faced in each level, and the reasons they chose to ascend higher. The Aztecs believed their ancestors came from Aztlan, sometimes described as located in the north but in other accounts situated in caves beneath the earth, a place from which the 7 tribes emerged to populate the Valley of Mexico. The Mayans constructed elaborate cave systems for ceremony and burial, treating these underground spaces as sacred portals to Xibalba, the place of fear and death, which their texts describe with enough architectural and geographic detail to suggest it was based on actual extensive cave networks they had explored. The fact that these American civilizations, developing in complete isolation from European, African and Asian cultures, independently arrived at similar concepts of extensive inhabited underground realms, suggests either a universal human psychological archetype or actual experiences with significant subterranean environments that became encoded in cultural memory. Even the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam preserve concepts of underground realms, though filtered through different theological frameworks. The Hebrew Sheol, the Christian Hell, and the Islamic Jahannam all exist in tradition as locations beneath the earth, places with distinct geography and characteristics. Medieval Christian literature in particular developed elaborate cartographies of hell, with detailed descriptions of its levels, rivers and architecture that read more like travel guides than theological abstractions. The journey of Christ into hell during the 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection, described in early Christian texts, includes specific details about breaking down bronze gates and freeing souls from chambers, suggesting descriptions influenced by knowledge of actual underground structures. Islamic texts describe the layers of Jahannam with precision, including the types of stone from which its structures are built and the geological features that define each level. While modern believers understand these as spiritual realities, the physical specificity of the descriptions indicates the authors were drawing on their experiences and knowledge of real subterranean environments to construct their theological geography. The transformation from myth to potential reality began in the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists started taking seriously the physical spaces that ancient legends described. In Turkey, a region where ancient texts from multiple cultures described underground cities, a local farmer discovered something that would eventually lead to one of the most significant archaeological finds related to underground civilizations. The Derinkuyu underground city, when fully excavated, revealed a subterranean complex that could house between 20 and 30,000 people across multiple levels, extending more than 200 feet below the surface. This was not a simple cave system or mining operation. This was an intentionally designed and constructed city with air circulation shafts, water wells, food storage rooms, or wine presses, chapels, schools, and even stables for livestock. The sophistication of the engineering boggled the minds of modern architects who examined the site. The ventilation system alone, designed to bring fresh air to the deepest levels while removing stale air and smoke, demonstrated an understanding of aerodynamics and pressure differentials that supposedly should not have existed when the city was built. What made Derinkuyu even more extraordinary was the discovery that it was not unique. Across the Cappadocia region of Turkey, archaeologists identified over 200 underground cities of varying sizes, many of them connected by tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the surface. Some of these connecting tunnels were wide enough for several people to walk abreast, while others were narrow passages that could be sealed at multiple points with massive stone doors that rolled into place from the inside, protecting the inhabitants from whatever threats they faced above ground. The question that haunted researchers was simple but profound. Why would ancient people invest the enormous labour required to carve entire cities from solid rock deep underground when the surface world offered far easier building conditions? The conventional explanation that these cities served as temporary refuges during invasions failed to satisfy many scholars, because the level of development suggested permanent habitation, complete with all the infrastructure necessary for long-term comfortable living. These were not crude shelters hastily carved in moments of desperation. These were sophisticated urban environments that had been carefully planned and executed over generations, suggesting their purpose went far beyond simple survival during brief periods of danger. The dating of these underground cities presented another puzzle that challenged historical assumptions. While most archaeologists attributed them to the early Byzantine period around the 6th to 10th centuries CE, evidence suggested much older origins. The soft volcanic rock of the region had been inhabited since the Hittite period at least, around 1800 BCE, and some researchers argued that the deepest and most sophisticated levels showed construction techniques and design elements that predated even the Hittites. If the oldest sections of these underground cities were constructed 4,000 years ago or more, they ranked among humanity's oldest architectural achievements, contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Yet unlike those famous surface monuments, these underground marvels had been virtually forgotten by history, preserved only in local legends that spoke of ancient peoples who lived beneath the earth and emerged only rarely to trade with surface dwellers. The fact that such enormous construction projects could essentially vanish from historical memory raised unsettling questions about what other achievements of ancient civilizations might lie hidden beneath our feet, waiting for accidental discovery by curious farmers or determined archaeologists. As news of the Turkish discoveries spread through academic circles, researchers began looking at their own regions with fresh eyes, wondering if local legends about underground cities might be more than superstition. In China, archaeologists investigating areas described in ancient texts as sites of underground palaces and tomb complexes began using modern ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging technology to map what lay beneath the surface. The results were staggering. Beneath the mausoleum of the first Qin emperor, Famous for its terracotta warriors, imaging revealed a vast complex of chambers and tunnels far more extensive than the portions that had been excavated. Ancient Chinese texts described the emperor's tomb as a microcosm of the empire, complete with rivers of mercury, palaces, treasure chambers, and deadly traps to deter thieves. Modern mercury testing of the soil above the unopened central tomb showed mercury levels nearly 100 times higher than surrounding areas, suggesting the ancient texts might be accurate about at least some of their descriptions. What fascinated researchers most was the discovery that the tomb complex connected to natural cave systems that extended for miles underground, suggesting the emperor's builders had not simply excavated chambers, but had incorporated existing underground structures into their design, perhaps believing these natural caves held special significance or power. The same pattern of discovery began repeating across continents. In Peru, researchers investigating Inca legends about a vast tunnel system called Chincanawasi, rumoured to connect the fortress of Sacsayhuaman with the Coricancha temple in Cusco, and extending all the way to the ancient capital of the Wari culture, began mapping known cave systems and comparing them to geometric patterns in surface structures. Local traditions insisted these tunnels had been sealed by the Incas during the Spanish conquest to protect sacred spaces and treasures from the invaders, but that they still existed beneath the ground, waiting to be rediscovered. While no one had yet found definitive proof of the extensive tunnel network, numerous smaller passages and chambers had been documented, often displaying the precise stonework for which the Incas were famous, massive blocks fitted together without mortar with such precision that a knife blade could not slip between them. The existence of these smaller passages suggested the legends of more extensive networks might be based on fact, that the Incas and their predecessors had indeed created significant underground infrastructure for purposes that remain unclear but were clearly of immense importance to their civilization. In Europe, beneath the cities and countryside that had been inhabited for millennia, researchers documented thousands of underground passages, chambers and complexes that defied simple explanation. The catacombs beneath Rome and Paris, famous as burial sites, represented only the smallest fraction of underground development. Beneath Edinburgh, archaeologists mapped an entire buried city, streets and buildings that had been built over as the city expanded upward, creating layers of urban development that descended deep below the current street level. Medieval Europe was honeycombed with underground passages, many of them connecting monasteries, castles, and churches, forming networks that allowed medieval Christians to move secretly during times of persecution or war. Some of these tunnel systems stretched for extraordinary distances. The tunnels beneath the Vatican were rumoured to extend for miles, connecting to distant locations throughout Rome, though the church maintained strict secrecy about their full extent and purpose. In Bavaria, researchers documented a network of underground passages called Erdstall that displayed puzzling features, including narrow sections that required crawling and chambers that seemed to serve no practical purpose for storage, habitation, or defence. Hundreds of these passages had been discovered, and aerial surveys suggested thousands more remained undocumented, hinting at a massive underground construction effort by medieval Europeans for reasons that remained mysterious. No discussion of potentially vast underground complexes could ignore Egypt, where ancient texts explicitly described elaborate subterranean structures, and modern investigations continue to reveal surprising depths beneath famous monuments. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote extensively about a structure he called the Labyrinth, located near Lake Moeris in the Fayum region. He described it as surpassing even the pyramids in grandeur, a massive complex of 3,000 rooms spread across 2 levels, one above ground and one below. Herodotus claimed Egyptian priests had shown him the upper level, which alone filled him with wonder, but refused him access to the underground level, explaining it contained the tombs of the pharaohs who built the structure and sacred chambers not meant for foreign eyes. His detailed description of the above-ground level, with its elaborate architecture and countless chambers connected by winding passages, suggested the underground portion must be equally or more impressive. Despite Herodotus' specific description of the location and nature of this labyrinth, modern archaeology had struggled to locate it, finding only ruins that seemed too modest to match the ancient account, leading some scholars to dismiss his description as exaggeration. Others argued that the true labyrinth remained buried beneath sand and silt, or its underground levels intact and waiting for proper excavation. Beneath the Giza Plateau, home to the Great Pyramid and Sphinx, ground-penetrating radar and seismic studies had revealed numerous anomalies suggesting chambers and passages that remained unexplored. Edgar Cayce, the famous American psychic, predicted in the 1930s that a hall of records would be discovered beneath the Sphinx, containing the wisdom of an ancient civilization that predated dynastic Egypt. While Cayce's predictions were often dismissed by mainstream archaeologists, geological studies of the Sphinx by researchers like Robert Schoch suggested water erosion patterns consistent with the monument being far older than traditionally dated, perhaps carved during a period of heavy rainfall that ended around 10,000 BCE. If the Sphinx was indeed that ancient, it suggested a sophisticated civilization existed in Egypt thousands of years before the pharaohs, a civilization that might have created the underground chambers that various researchers claim to have detected beneath the monument. Egyptian authorities had been reluctant to authorize excavations beneath the Sphinx, partly due to concerns about destabilizing the already fragile monument, but many researchers suspected political and religious sensitivities also played a role. If underground chambers were discovered containing evidence of a pre-pharaonic civilization, it would require rewriting not just Egyptian history, but the entire timeline of human civilization. Ancient Egyptian texts themselves provided tantalizing references to underground structures. The pyramid texts inscribed in the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara described passages and chambers within the earth where the pharaoh's spirit would travel during its transformation. While Egyptologists interpreted these as mythological descriptions of the afterlife journey, the architectural precision of the language suggested the authors might be describing real spaces. The Book of the Two Ways, a collection of funerary texts, provided what appeared to be actual maps of underground passages, including instructions for navigating through gates and choosing correct paths at various intersections. The level of detail in these texts far exceeded what would be necessary for purely spiritual guidance, including descriptions of the materials from which walls and doors were constructed, the colours of various chambers, and even the types of beings one might encounter in different sections. Some researchers suggested these texts were describing initiatory journeys that living priests undertook through actual underground complexes beneath temples and pyramids, experiences that were then encoded as guidance for the deceased pharaoh's spiritual journey. If this interpretation was correct, it meant extensive underground structures existed beneath various Egyptian sites, structures that might still remain sealed and hidden, protected by the very secrecy that the ancient texts were designed to maintain. The Serapeum at Saqqara provided physical evidence that the Egyptians had indeed created underground chambers far more sophisticated than conventional archaeology typically acknowledged. This underground complex contained massive stone boxes carved from single pieces of granite, each weighing dozens of tons, and fitted with precision-ground lids that created near-perfect seals. The conventional explanation held that these were sarcophagi for sacred Apis bulls, yet several puzzling features challenged this simple interpretation. The precision of the stone cutting exceeded what should have been possible with copper tools, the supposed technology of the time. The boxes showed no tool marks that would indicate how they were carved and hollowed. The lids weighed so much that moving them into position would have required sophisticated engineering, yet they were located in underground chambers with limited access. Some of the boxes contained no remains at all, while others showed evidence of having been opened and resealed multiple times in antiquity. Alternative researchers suggested these boxes might have served a different purpose entirely, perhaps as containers for something far more valuable than bull mummies, or possibly as examples of technology that predated dynastic Egypt entirely. The Egyptian government's control over access to the Serapeum prevented truly independent investigation, leaving many questions unanswered and fueling speculation about what other underground chambers might exist nearby, still sealed and undiscovered. The Osiris Shaft, discovered beneath the Giza Causeway in the 1930s, but not fully explored until the 1990s, provided another example of sophisticated underground construction in Egypt. This shaft descended over 90 feet through solid bedrock to reach a chamber containing a massive granite sarcophagus surrounded by water. The entire structure seemed designed as a three-dimensional representation of the mythological tomb of Osiris, with the water representing the primordial waters of creation. The precision cutting of the shaft through solid rock, the placement of the multi-ton sarcophagus at the bottom, and the engineering required to control the water level all demonstrated capabilities that pushed the limits of what conventional Egyptology attributed to ancient builders. More intriguing were indications that additional chambers might exist at even deeper levels, possibly accessed through underwater passages. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities halted further exploration, citing safety concerns and the delicate nature of the site, but researchers who had briefly accessed the deeper levels reported seeing passages leading away from the main chamber, suggesting this was not an isolated structure but part of a larger underground complex. If similar structures existed beneath other locations on the Giza Plateau, and if they were connected by the tunnel systems that various researchers claimed to have detected, it would suggest a vast underground development that would rival or exceed anything visible on the surface. The Americas offered their own evidence of ancient underground development, much of it still shrouded in mystery and complicated by the destruction of indigenous knowledge during European conquest. In Ecuador, a controversial discovery in the 1970s claimed to have found an extensive tunnel system containing artifacts that challenged conventional understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. A local man named Juan Morich reported finding an entrance to a vast underground tunnel network in the Taos Caves region. Passages that he claimed were clearly artificial, too regular and precise to be natural formations. He described metal libraries, repositories of thin metal sheets inscribed with unknown writing, and artifacts made from materials that should not have existed in ancient South America. The Ecuadorian government organized an official expedition to investigate, which included astronaut Neil Armstrong among its members. The expedition confirmed the existence of significant caves and found some artifacts, but the most extraordinary claims from Morich could not be verified, and controversy erupted over whether he had led the expedition to the actual chambers he had originally discovered or had deliberately misled them. The Taos Caves remained an object of fascination for researchers who believed Morich had genuinely found something extraordinary, but had chosen to protect its location rather than see it exploited or destroyed. In North America, indigenous traditions spoke of underground passages and chambers used by ancient peoples, some of them reportedly extending for many miles beneath the surface. In the Grand Canyon region, a peculiar story emerged in 1909 when the Arizona Gazette published an article describing a discovery by Smithsonian-funded explorers of an enormous underground citadel carved into the canyon walls. The article described Egyptian-style artifacts, chambers filled with mummies and copper weapons, suggesting ancient contact between Egypt and the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. The article noted it included specific names, dates, and locations, unusual detail for a fabricated story. Attempts to locate the cave described in the article were complicated by the vast size of the Grand Canyon and restrictions on exploration within the national park. But some researchers claim to have found sealed cave entrances in the general area described, entrances that appeared to have been deliberately closed with masonry work. Whether the original story was true or not, the Grand Canyon region definitely contained extensive cave systems, many unexplored, and indigenous Hopi traditions placed the Sipapuni, their place of emergence from the previous world, in this general region, suggesting the area held deep significance in native understanding of underground sacred spaces. Beneath the streets of Los Angeles, workers and explorers over the decades had reported finding unusual tunnels that seemed too old and too sophisticated to be part of the city's known infrastructure. Some of these tunnels were attributed to bootleggers during Prohibition, but others showed construction techniques and states of aging that suggested much greater antiquity. In 1933, a mining engineer named G. Warren Schufelt claimed to have detected, using radio frequency equipment, a vast network of tunnels beneath downtown Los Angeles. He believed these tunnels were created by a lost civilization he called the Lizard People, and based on Hopi legends he had heard about an ancient race that built underground cities to survive catastrophes on the surface. Schufelt produced a detailed map of the tunnel system he claimed to have detected, and began an excavation at a site near the Central Library, but after reaching a certain depth, the project was mysteriously halted and the shaft filled in. Schufelt never explained publicly why the excavation ended, leading to speculation that he had either found nothing or had found something that he or authorities decided should remain hidden. In subsequent decades, construction workers in downtown Los Angeles occasionally broke through into old tunnels, that matched no city records, tunnels that were typically sealed and forgotten rather than explored and documented. The Midwest region of the United States contained numerous mysteries related to ancient mound-building cultures and their possible underground developments. The great earthwork mounds of the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian cultures were primarily known as above-ground structures, but excavations frequently revealed underground chambers, burial vaults, and passages that demonstrated sophisticated engineering. The Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, and hundreds of similar structures across the region all incorporated underground elements that suggested their builders had knowledge and purposes that extended beneath the surface. Some researchers argued that many mounds were not simply piled earth but rather carefully constructed buildings that had been covered over, either intentionally by their builders or gradually through natural processes and later earthwork. This theory suggested that sophisticated underground chambers might still exist within these mounds, chambers that had never been properly excavated because conventional archaeology assumed the mounds were solid earth throughout. Metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar used on various mounds had detected anomalies consistent with hollow spaces and metallic objects deep within the structures, but most sites were protected from excavation by their designation as sacred Native American sites, leaving these mysteries unresolved. In Central America, the Mayan civilization left behind clear evidence of sophisticated underground development in the form of elaborate cave systems that they had modified and used for ceremony. The Mayans considered caves to be portals to Xibalba, their underworld, and they treated these spaces with profound reverence. At sites like the cave beneath the pyramid at Chichen Itza and the vast chamber beneath the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, archaeologists discovered evidence of ritual use dating back thousands of years, including offerings, altars, and modifications to the natural rock that demonstrated engineering capabilities. The Mayans also constructed artificial caves and underground chambers beneath many of their surface buildings, creating subterranean levels that mirrored the visible architecture above. At Palenque, researchers discovered tunnels beneath the Temple of Inscriptions that led to hidden chambers, and they suspected more passages remained undiscovered. The Mayan city of Tikal showed evidence of a complex network of reservoirs and channels beneath the plazas, a sophisticated water management system that operated largely underground. The full extent of Mayan underground development remained unclear because the thick jungle vegetation made ground surveys difficult, and because much of the region remained unexplored by archaeologists. Local traditions among modern Mayan descendants spoke of extensive tunnel systems connecting various ancient cities, passages that the Spanish had never found and that remained hidden in the jungle, but verification of these traditions remained elusive. Beyond the archaeological evidence and ancient legends, geologists contributed to the discussion by pointing out that vast underground spaces definitely existed naturally within the Earth's crust, from cavities and passages created by water erosion, volcanic activity, and tectonic processes over millions of years. The question was not whether large underground spaces existed, because they clearly did, but rather whether they existed on a scale and in configurations that could support the legendary underground civilizations, and whether ancient peoples had the knowledge to find and utilize these spaces effectively. The Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky provided a documented example of just how extensive natural cave systems could be. With over 400 miles of surveyed passages, Mammoth Cave was the longest known cave system in the world, and experts believed much of the system remained unexplored and unmapped. If a single cave system could extend for hundreds of miles, the possibility of multiple interconnected systems spanning even greater distances seemed geologically plausible. The question became whether ancient peoples had knowledge of these systems, and whether they left evidence of habitation that modern explorers might have missed or misinterpreted as natural formations. Karst topography, the landscape formed by the dissolution of soluble rocks like limestone, covered significant portions of the Earth's land surface and was characterized by sinkholes, underground rivers, and extensive cave networks. In regions like southern China, the Balkans, and parts of the southeastern United States, karst features dominated the geology, creating landscapes where the underground world rivaled or exceeded the surface in terms of volume and complexity. The limestone caves of China's Guizhou province contained chambers so enormous they had their own weather systems, with clouds forming and rain falling inside the caverns. In these vast underground spaces, the line between cave and potential habitable area blurred. If ancient peoples had discovered these enormous chambers, they would have found spaces large enough to build entire cities, with sufficient air circulation to support populations and water sources from underground rivers and streams. The discovery of ancient artifacts in many cave systems around the world demonstrated that humans had indeed explored these spaces extensively in the past, but whether they had established permanent habitations deep underground remained a question that divided researchers. Lava tubes created by volcanic activity offered another type of natural underground space that ancient peoples might have utilized. When lava flows from a volcano, the outer surface cools and solidifies, while the interior remains molten and continues to flow, eventually draining away and leaving behind a hollow tube. Some lava tubes reached enormous dimensions. In Hawaii, the Kazumura cave lava tube extended for over 40 miles and reached depths of more than 3,000 feet below the surface. The Thurston lava tube, open to tourists, demonstrated how spacious and accessible these natural formations could be, with ceiling heights reaching over 20 feet in some sections. Ancient Hawaiian traditions spoke of the Menehune, a race of small people who lived in the forests and caves and who built structures overnight. And while these legends were generally dismissed as mythology, they reflected an awareness of underground spaces and perhaps a cultural memory of ancient peoples who did utilize the lava tubes more extensively than their descendants. In other volcanic regions around the world, from Iceland to the Canary Islands to the Pacific Northwest of North America, lava tubes provided ready-made underground corridors that required little modification to become usable spaces for human habitation or travel. The concept of vast underground spaces received unexpected support from geological research into deep crustal structures and the behavior of groundwater. Hydrogeologists studying aquifer systems discovered that water existed in permeable rock layers at profound depths, sometimes many thousands of feet below the surface, and that this water moved through interconnected networks of cracks, fissures, and dissolved channels. If water could travel these routes, the spaces through which it moved must be substantial, and in some cases these water passages might open into larger cavities. The discovery of extremophile microorganisms living in water drawn from deep boreholes proved that the deep subsurface was not a sterile environment, but rather harboured ecosystems adapted to darkness, pressure, and isolation from the surface. If life could exist at these depths, the ancient question of whether complex underground environments could support higher organisms, including humans, shifted from impossible to merely difficult. The challenge for ancient underground civilizations would not be whether the spaces existed, but whether they could access them, create sustainable life support systems, and adapt to the unique environmental challenges of permanent underground habitation. Tectonic activity created another class of underground spaces in the form of fissures and rifts, where massive blocks of the Earth's crust had shifted relative to each other. In regions of geological instability, these fissures could open passages into the deep subsurface that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Iceland, sitting atop the mid-Atlantic ridge where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates separated, contained numerous examples of such fissures, some of them penetrating to unknown depths into the earth. Divers exploring water-filled sections of these fissures had descended to depths where sunlight completely faded, and finding themselves in passages that continued deeper than they could safely explore. The Silfra Fissure, a popular diving site, represented just one example of many such openings into the subterranean realm. Ancient Icelandic sagas spoke of beings who dwelt beneath the earth, emerging through caves and fissures, and while these stories were preserved as mythology about dwarves and other supernatural beings, they might represent cultural memories of actual encounters with people, or evidence of past human activity in these underground spaces. The geologically active regions of the Earth, where tectonic forces constantly reshaped the landscape, might have provided ancient peoples with access routes to the deep subsurface that periodically opened and closed as the Earth moved, creating windows of opportunity for exploration and exploitation that would later seal themselves, leaving no obvious trace on the surface. The discussion of ancient underground development inevitably raised questions about the engineering capabilities of ancient civilizations, their understanding of geology and structural mechanics, and their ability to execute projects of enormous scale with supposedly primitive technology. Conventional archaeology maintained that ancient peoples progressed gradually from simple stone tools to bronze and then iron, with corresponding increases in their ability to quarry rock, excavate earth, and construct durable buildings. This progression model struggled to account for certain achievements that seemed to require capabilities that should not have existed at the time they were created. The precision stonework of the Incas, fitting massive irregular blocks together with tolerances of a millimetre or less, exceeded what modern stonemasons could achieve working manually. The enormous stone blocks of Baalbek in Lebanon, including the famous stone of the pregnant woman weighing an estimated 1,000 tons, demonstrated quarrying and moving capabilities that challenged modern engineering. The sophisticated water management systems of ancient Rome, the precision of Egyptian pyramid construction, and the vast scale of works like the Great Wall of China all indicated that ancient peoples possessed engineering knowledge and organizational capabilities that conventional models might underestimate. When examining underground construction specifically, ancient engineers demonstrated abilities that seemed particularly advanced. The Persian Qanat systems, underground channels that transported water from mountain aquifers to distant cities, extended for many miles beneath the surface, precisely graded to maintain proper water flow without pumps or mechanical aids. The construction of qanats required accurate surveying to keep the channels on course despite being excavated from multiple shaft points simultaneously, workers digging toward each other through solid ground and meeting with remarkable precision. The oldest qanats dated back nearly 3,000 years, and the technology might have been even more ancient. Thousands of these underground channels existed throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, representing a monumental investment in underground infrastructure that served critical economic and survival purposes. The engineers who designed and built these systems clearly understood hydrology, geology, and surveying at a sophisticated level, knowledge that could equally have been applied to creating inhabitable underground spaces if that had been their intention. The Roman catacombs represented another example of extensive ancient underground excavation, with hundreds of miles of passages and chambers carved beneath the city. While these spaces served primarily as burial sites, their construction demonstrated that Roman engineers could create vast underground networks and keep them stable over centuries. The catacombs included sophisticated ventilation shafts, structural supports, and drainage systems to prevent flooding from groundwater. The same engineering principles that allowed the Romans to create this underground necropolis could have been applied to create living spaces if Romans had chosen to do so. Some researchers noted that certain sections of the catacombs showed architectural features more consistent with habitation than burial, including niches that might have served as bed alcoves, smoke-blackened ceilings suggesting cooking fires, and cisterns for water storage. Whether these features represented temporary refuges during times of persecution or indicated more sustained underground habitation remained a topic of debate, but they demonstrated that the Romans possessed both the capability and at least occasionally the motivation to create functional underground living environments. The engineering knowledge required for extensive underground development included not just excavation techniques, but also sophisticated understanding of air circulation, water management, structural stability, and illumination. Ancient texts and archaeological evidence showed that all of these challenges had been addressed by various civilizations with surprising effectiveness. Ventilation shafts in the Great Pyramid of Giza, long a source of speculation about their purpose, demonstrated that Egyptian engineers understood the need for air circulation in enclosed spaces and knew how to design shafts that would naturally draw fresh air through the structure without mechanical fans. The mines of ancient Spain, worked extensively by Romans for gold, silver, and other metals, thus penetrated deep into mountains and required constant pumping to prevent flooding and ventilation systems to provide breathable air to workers far underground. The engineering solutions developed for mining, including the Archimedes screw for lifting water, the hydraulic hammer for breaking rock, and the fire-setting technique for thermal fracturing of stone, could equally have been applied to creating underground habitations. The line between a mine and an underground city was primarily one of intention and finishing work, rather than fundamental engineering capability. Illumination in underground spaces posed a challenge that ancient peoples addressed through several methods. The simplest solution was fire, whether torches, oil lamps, or candles. And archaeological evidence confirmed extensive use of these light sources in ancient underground spaces. However, fire consumed oxygen and produced smoke, creating serious problems in enclosed spaces without excellent ventilation. Ancient texts sometimes mentioned alternative lighting methods that seemed mysterious or impossible. The references in Hindu texts to gems that illuminated Patala without fire, the Greek legends of the golden fleece that glowed with its own light, and the Egyptian accounts of stones that shone like the sun all suggested the possibility of non-fire-based illumination. Modern researchers who dismissed these as mythological exaggeration sometimes overlooked the possibility that ancient peoples might have discovered luminescent materials, perhaps minerals that glowed through phosphorescence or bioluminescent organisms that could be cultivated for light. The discovery in recent decades of certain bacteria and fungi that produce significant bioluminescence opened the possibility that ancient peoples might have used similar organisms deliberately for lighting, a technology that would leave no archaeological trace because the organisms would die when the underground spaces were abandoned. The question of how ancient peoples could have lived and worked in deep underground environments for extended periods without being overwhelmed by smoke and oxygen depletion remained a significant challenge to theories of extensive ancient underground civilizations. But the existence of solutions in ancient texts and the evidence of sustained activity in places like the deepest levels of Derinkuyu suggested that effective methods had been developed, even if we had not yet rediscovered or understood them. The concept of extensive underground development sometimes became confused or conflated with the more radical theory of the hollow Earth, the idea that our planet was not a solid sphere but rather a shell, with vast open spaces in the interior, possibly with openings at the poles that could allow entry. The hollow Earth theory, while largely rejected by mainstream science due to seismological evidence showing the Earth's internal structure, had a long history in speculative literature and alternative research, and it contributed to the broader cultural fascination with underground worlds. The theory drew support from misunderstandings of exploration reports, including statements attributed to Admiral Richard Byrd about finding lands beyond the poles, and from earlier scientific speculation before seismology provided direct information about the Earth's interior structure. In the 17th and 18th centuries, respected scientists including Edmund Halley and Leonhard Euler proposed versions of a hollow Earth based on calculations of the planet's density and gravitational effects, and these theories were not considered fringe speculation, but rather serious scientific hypotheses of their time. The hollow Earth concept received its most famous fictional treatment in Jules Verne's novel Journey to the Centre of the Earth, published in 1864, which described explorers descending through a volcanic crater in Iceland to discover a vast underground ocean, prehistoric creatures, and evidence of earlier human explorers. Verne's novel, while fiction, was carefully researched and incorporated real geological knowledge of his era, making it seem scientifically plausible to readers. The book inspired generations of explorers and researchers to take seriously the possibility that large unknown spaces might exist deep within the planet. Later authors like Edgar Rice Burroughs elaborated on the concept with his Pellucidar series, describing an entire inner world with its own sun at the Earth's core, populated by prehistoric beasts and primitive humans. These fictional treatments kept the concept alive in popular imagination, even as scientific understanding of the Earth's actual structure developed through seismology in the 20th century. Seismological research, particularly after major earthquakes that sent shockwaves through the planet's interior, provided direct evidence about the Earth's internal structure. The behavior of different types of seismic waves as they pass through the Earth reveal distinct layers with different densities and states, including the solid inner core of iron and nickel, the liquid outer core, the viscous mantle, and the thin solid crust on which we live. This evidence made clear that the Earth was not hollow in the sense that early theorists had imagined, with a vast open cavity in the interior. However, seismology could not rule out the existence of substantial cavities within the crust, the relatively thin outer shell of the planet. The crust varied from about 3 miles thick under the oceans to 30 miles or more under continental regions, and within this zone, cavities and passages could theoretically exist without significantly affecting seismic measurements or the planet's overall structure. The question shifted from whether the entire Earth was hollow to whether the crust contained cavities larger and more numerous than conventional geology acknowledged. Some researchers attempted to reconcile hollow Earth concepts with scientific evidence by proposing that the theory should not be taken literally but rather understood as describing extensive networks of large caverns and tunnels within the upper crust. They argued that ancient accounts of underground kingdoms and modern reports of unusual cave systems might reflect the existence of cavity networks so extensive they created in effect a second world within the first, layered spaces that extended for such distances that travellers within them might feel they had entered another realm entirely. This modified theory, sometimes called the honeycomb Earth or Swiss cheese Earth hypothesis, suggested that geological processes including volcanic activity, water erosion, and tectonic fracturing created far more underground space than surface geology typically indicated, and that these spaces in some regions might connect into vast networks. While mainstream geology remained skeptical that such networks existed on the scale these theories proposed, the documented extent of systems like Mammoth Cave demonstrated that the principle was at least partially valid, that interconnected underground spaces could extend for hundreds of miles, and that by extension, even more extensive systems might exist undiscovered. The legacy of Hollow Earth theories influenced how researchers approached reports of underground anomalies and discoveries. Claims of finding entrances to underground realms were often dismissed as belonging to the same category as flat Earth beliefs or other rejected theories, guilt by association with the discredited Hollow Earth concept. This dismissal sometimes prevented serious investigation of reports that might have contained valuable information about actual caves, tunnels, or underground structures. When explorers reported finding unusual passages or chambers, skeptics reflexively categorized these accounts as Hollow Earth nonsense, rather than evaluating them on their specific merits. This created a challenging environment for legitimate research into ancient underground development, because bringing up the topic immediately triggered associations with fringe theories, making academic archaeologists reluctant to pursue investigations that might damage their professional reputations. The irony was that by rejecting all discussion of extensive underground spaces because of association with Hollow Earth theories, mainstream archaeology might have missed opportunities to discover and document real, ancient underground achievements that deserved recognition as significant accomplishments of human engineering and civilization. Across cultures and throughout history, underground spaces held profound religious and spiritual significance, treated as sacred portals between the ordinary world and realms of power, danger, and transformation. This spiritual dimension of caves and underground chambers suggested that ancient peoples experienced these spaces as qualitatively different from the surface world, places where normal rules did not apply and where contact with divine or supernatural forces became possible. The almost universal association of underground spaces with the sacred might indicate that something about these environments triggered altered states of consciousness or profound psychological experiences that ancient peoples interpreted through their religious frameworks. Modern studies of cave environments revealed several factors that could contribute to such experiences, including low oxygen levels in poorly ventilated areas producing mild hypoxia, natural electromagnetic anomalies in certain rock formations, and the sensory deprivation of complete darkness and silence, creating conditions conducive to hallucination and mystical experience. The use of caves for initiatory rites mark them as transformative spaces in many ancient cultures. The Greek Eleusinian mysteries, the most famous secret religious rites of the ancient world, included a component where initiates descended into an underground chamber to experience visions and revelations that they were forbidden to describe to non-initiates. The limited information that survived about these mysteries suggested they involved some combination of darkness, fasting, possibly psychoactive substances, and symbolic death and rebirth, with the underground space serving as a literal and metaphorical journey into the underworld from which the initiate emerged transformed. Similar initiatory use of caves appeared in various traditions around the world. Australian Aboriginal cultures used sacred caves for initiation ceremonies where young men underwent trials and received secret knowledge. The kivas of the American Southwest, partially underground ceremonial chambers, served as sites for religious rituals involving descent into the earth as a symbolic return to the womb of origin. The consistent use of underground spaces for initiation suggested these environments held universal human psychological significance related to themes of death, rebirth, and transformation. Lasa 7. Oracle sites in the ancient world frequently involved caves or underground chambers where priests or priestesses delivered prophecies. The Oracle of Delphi in Greece, the most famous prophetic site of the ancient Mediterranean, operated from a chamber within the Temple of Apollo that modern research suggested was positioned over a geological fault that released ethylene gas, a natural substance that could produce trance states and visions. The Pythia, the priestess who delivered the oracle's prophecies, sat on a tripod over a fissure in the chamber floor, breathing the vapours that rose from the earth below, and in this altered state she spoke words that priests interpreted as messages from the god Apollo. Whether the Pythia's prophecies resulted from divine inspiration, gas-induced hallucination, sect or shrewd political calculation by the priests, the association between underground chambers, volcanic exhalations and prophetic ability was firmly established in ancient Greek culture. Similar patterns appeared in other oracle sites, including the Oracle of Trophonius at Lebedea, where those seeking prophecy had to descend into a cave and spend the night underground, experiencing visions that often left them deeply disturbed or transformed. The power attributed to these underground oracle sites suggested ancient peoples believed the subsurface realm provided access to knowledge and powers not available in the ordinary surface world. Burial in caves and underground chambers represented another dimension of the sacred relationship with subterranean spaces. The practice appeared in the earliest evidence of ritual behavior in human evolution, with Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens both burying their dead in caves with apparent ceremony. The placement of the dead underground aligned with widespread beliefs that the afterlife existed beneath the surface, and that burial returned the deceased to the realm from which life had emerged. The elaborate underground tombs of ancient Egypt, the catacombs of Rome, the passage tombs of Neolithic Ireland like Newgrange with its underground chambers accessed through narrow passages, all indicated that underground space held special significance related to death and the afterlife. Some researchers argued that this funerary use of caves and underground chambers might have developed from earlier practices of actually living underground. That ancient peoples first dwelt in caves and then, after moving to surface dwellings, retained the underground realm as specifically sacred space associated with the powers of birth, death, and rebirth. This interpretation suggested a cultural memory of earlier underground habitation encoded in religious practices that persisted long after the original practical reasons for living underground had ceased to apply. The concept of sacred geography often positioned underground spaces as complementary opposites to mountain peaks, the depths of the earth balanced against the heights of the sky. In many cosmologies, the supreme deities dwelt on mountaintops or in the heavens, while the gods of the underworld ruled the depths, creating a vertical axis that connected the different realms of existence. Humans occupied the middle realm, the surface world, but could journey upward toward the divine through climbing sacred mountains or building towers and pyramids, or could journey downward into the underworld through descending into caves and excavated chambers. This vertical cosmology appeared in cultures worldwide, from the world tree of Norse mythology that connected different levels of reality to the axis mundi concepts of various Asian traditions that described the center of the world as a mountain or pillar connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. The persistence of this vertical model of reality suggested it reflected fundamental patterns in human consciousness and in how we experience space, with up and down, sky and earth, light and darkness forming paired opposites that defined our understanding of existence. The underground world in this framework was not simply empty space beneath our feet, but rather a complementary realm as essential to the complete cosmos as the sky above. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new technologies for exploring underground environments and for detecting hidden chambers and passages without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic imaging, electrical resistivity tomography, and other geophysical survey methods allowed researchers to map subsurface structures with increasing precision. These technologies revolutionized archaeology by enabling surveys of large areas to identify promising sites for excavation before committing resources to digging. Applied to the question of ancient underground development, these technologies revealed numerous anomalies and unexplained structures beneath known archaeological sites and in remote locations where surface features suggested nothing unusual. The challenge was that detecting an anomaly did not necessarily identify what it was, whether a natural geological feature, an ancient constructed chamber, or a modern disturbance. Confirmation required excavation, and funding for exploratory excavation based on ambiguous geophysical data was difficult to obtain, leaving many detected anomalies uninvestigated and their nature unknown. In Egypt, the use of modern imaging technology beneath the Giza Plateau and other major archaeological sites produced tantalizing results that suggested extensive undiscovered structures. A Japanese team using electromagnetic sounding equipment in the 1980s detected what appeared to be a tunnel or chamber beneath the causeway connecting the Sphinx to the second pyramid. Egyptian authorities approved limited drilling to investigate the anomaly, and the drill encountered a void space at the predicted location. But further investigation was halted without public explanation, leaving the nature of the discovered cavity unknown. Similar incidents occurred at multiple Egyptian sites, where researchers detected apparent chambers or passages, received initial authorization to investigate, and then found their projects cancelled or denied further access. The pattern frustrated many researchers and fed speculation that Egyptian authorities, or the international archaeological establishment, were actively suppressing discoveries that might challenge orthodox interpretations of ancient Egyptian civilization. Whether such suppression was occurring, or whether the cancelled projects simply reflected the normal difficulties of archaeological politics and the legitimate concerns about preserving fragile sites, the result was that numerous detected anomalies beneath Egyptian monuments remained unexplored and unverified. In Bosnia, a controversial claim emerged in 2005 that several hills near the town of Visoko were actually ancient pyramids, the largest stone structures on Earth, covered by soil and vegetation over millennia. The main proponent, Senad Omanovic, organised excavations that uncovered tunnels and chambers beneath the hills, stone blocks that appeared to be part of constructed walls, and geometric features that he argued proved artificial construction. Mainstream archaeologists dismissed the Bosnian pyramid claims as pseudo-archaeology, arguing that the hills were natural formations and that any regular features resulted from geological processes or recent human activity. However, the tunnel systems discovered beneath the hills during the excavation efforts were extensive and showed features including stone blocks that appeared to have been shaped and placed deliberately, clay-sealed walls, and chambers with acoustic properties suggesting intentional design. Whether these tunnels were ancient constructions, medieval excavations, or even recent work by local people, they demonstrated that significant underground development existed in the region, and that dismissing everything associated with the pyramid claims might mean overlooking legitimate archaeological features worthy of proper study. The polarized debate between believers and skeptics prevented objective investigation, with each side so invested in proving the other wrong that the actual features and their origin became secondary to the political battle. In Antarctica, ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed unusual geometric features beneath the ice sheets that some researchers suggested might be ruins of structures built before the continent was covered in ice. Mainstream geology held that Antarctica had been frozen for millions of years, making human structures impossible. But alternative researchers pointed to evidence that parts of the continent might have been ice-free as recently as 12,000 years ago, potentially allowing a brief window during which a warm climate civilization could have existed there. The geometric features detected by radar included what appeared to be right-angle intersections, regular spacing suggestive of planned layout, and straight lines extending for considerable distances, all features more consistent with artificial construction than with natural geological formations. However, confirming the nature of these features would require excavation through hundreds of feet of ice, a monumental and expensive undertaking that no research team had yet attempted. The features remained catalogued as anomalies, their nature unknown and their existence serving as fuel for speculation rather than confirmed knowledge. The remoteness and harsh conditions of Antarctica meant that many detected features would likely remain uninvestigated for decades to come, keeping the question of what lay beneath the ice unresolved. Underwater discoveries added another dimension to the search for ancient underground connections, as rising sea levels since the last ice age had submerged many coastal areas where ancient peoples lived. Off the coast of India near Mahabalipuram, divers discovered extensive stone structures underwater that appeared to be ruins of temples and buildings, confirming local traditions of 7 temples, 6 of which had been swallowed by the sea. Similarly, and structures off the coast of Cuba detected by sonar at depths of 2,000 feet showed geometric patterns suggesting intentional construction, though the depth made verification extremely difficult, and the origin of these features remained contested. What intrigued some researchers was the possibility that ancient coastal settlements might have included tunnel systems that extended inland, and that as sea levels rose, these tunnel entrances might have been submerged while the inland portions remained accessible through entries that were above the flood levels. This scenario could explain legends in coastal regions around the world about passages leading from the sea into underground chambers far inland, passages that might once have started at coastal caves or structures now lost beneath the waves. The concept of underground worlds and civilizations permeated literature and popular culture, reflecting the persistent human fascination with what might lie beneath our feet. Beyond Jules Verne's famous novel, numerous authors explored the theme, each adding their own variations to the mythology of the underground world. Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel The Coming Race, published in 1871, described a highly advanced civilization living in enormous underground caverns, the Vrilya people who possessed a mysterious energy called Vril that gave them godlike powers. The novel was written as satire, but many readers took it as revealing secret truths, and the concept of Vril energy entered occult literature as a real force that initiated individuals might learn to harness. The notion of a superior underground race watching the surface dwellers and potentially planning to emerge and take control became a recurring theme in both fiction and conspiracy theories, tapping into deep anxieties about the hidden and unknown. H.P. Lovecraft contributed his own unique vision of the underground world through stories set in his fictional universe, describing vast caverns beneath the earth inhabited by ancient races including the Elder Things, the Shoggoths, and the blind albino penguins that served as food for the underground dwellers. Lovecraft's underground realms were places of horror, where human explorers who ventured too deep discovered truths that shattered their sanity. His story. At the Mountains of Madness described an Antarctic expedition that discovered a range of impossibly high mountains concealing the ruins of an ancient alien city, with passages leading deep beneath the ice into realms that had existed for hundreds of millions of years. While Lovecraft's work was explicitly fiction, his detailed descriptions of underground architecture and biology influenced how readers imagined such environments, and his concept of ancient knowledge so terrible that it destroyed those who learned it added a cautionary dimension to the romantic appeal of underground exploration. The Lovecraftian vision suggested that some mysteries might be better left unexplored, that the underground world might contain not lost wisdom and treasure, but rather things inimical to human existence that had been sealed away for good reason. In the mid-20th century, the concept of underground worlds intersected with the growing interest in UFOs and ancient astronauts, producing theories that combined extraterrestrial visitors with subterranean civilizations. Writers like Raymond Bernard in his book The Hollow Earth proposed that flying saucers emerged not from outer space, but from openings at the North and South Poles that led to advanced civilizations dwelling in the Earth's interior. These theories often incorporated elements from various sources, including Admiral Byrd's purported Antarctic discoveries, Nazi expeditions to both poles, and Tibetan legends about subterranean kingdoms like Agartha and Shambhala. The resulting synthesis of ideas created an elaborate mythology that positioned the underground world as the true seat of advanced ancient civilizations, possibly descended from Atlantis or Lemuria, who occasionally surfaced to monitor and influence events in the ignorant surface world. While these theories lacked scientific credibility, they achieved wide cultural penetration, influencing thousands of books, websites, and believers who accepted them as hidden truths suppressed by governments and mainstream academia. Comic books and movies brought underground civilizations to mass audiences through popular entertainment. The Marvel Comics character Namor the Submariner ruled Atlantis, while other storylines featured the Moloids and other underground races. DC Comics featured the underground city of Skartaris in the Warlord series, accessed through a portal at the North Pole, a direct homage to Hollow Earth theories. The 1970s television series Land of the Lost featured a family trapped in an underground world populated by dinosaurs and strange civilizations, introducing the concept to young viewers. Movies like Journey to the Center of the Earth were remade multiple times, each generation getting its own version of the story. The 2008 film brought modern special effects to create a visually spectacular underground world that captivated new audiences. These popular culture treatments, while not claiming to be factual, kept the concept of underground civilizations alive in collective imagination, and ensured that each new generation encountered the idea and pondered its possibilities. Video games embraced underground exploration as a core mechanic, allowing players to experience simulated journeys into the depths. Minecraft's underground world, extending deep below the surface with complex cave systems, ore deposits, and eventually the Netherrealm accessed through special portals, gave millions of players their own procedurally generated underground realms to explore. Games like Terraria, Dwarf Fortress, and Deep Rock Galactic all featured extensive underground environments as central to gameplay. These games demonstrated the enduring appeal of underground exploration, the sense of discovery that came from revealing what was hidden, the tension between the claustrophobic enclosure of caves and the vast surprise of enormous caverns. Players who spent hundreds of hours exploring these virtual underground worlds developed an intuitive sense of how such environments might function, what challenges they might present, and how civilizations might adapt to living permanently beneath the surface. This gaming culture created a generation familiar with underground spaces in ways that no previous generation had been, even if only through simulation, potentially changing how seriously people considered the possibility of real underground development. Mainstream archaeology and geology approached claims of ancient underground civilizations with substantial skepticism, pointing to numerous practical and logical problems with such theories. The primary argument was simple. No credible physical evidence existed for extensive ancient underground cities beyond the known examples like Derinkuyu, which, while impressive, could be explained through conventional archaeology as refuges built during historically documented periods of conflict. Critics noted that proponents of hidden underground civilizations relied heavily on legend, ancient texts that could be interpreted metaphorically, ambiguous geophysical data, and alleged discoveries that could never be independently verified because the locations were kept secret or access was restricted. This pattern of evidence paralleled that of other fringe theories, suggesting that underground civilization claims belonged to pseudo-archaeology rather than legitimate research. Skeptics argued that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that tales of vast tunnel networks connecting continents or advanced ancient races living in the Earth's depths fell into the category of extraordinary claims that lacked the supporting evidence necessary to take them seriously. The logistical challenges of sustaining human populations underground for extended periods presented another skeptical argument. Modern deep underground facilities like the Cheyenne Mountain Complex and deep mines required constant mechanical ventilation, artificial lighting, and extensive supply chains to maintain the environment and provide necessities for even small populations. Ancient peoples, without electricity, mechanical ventilation, or sophisticated supply networks would have faced enormous challenges attempting to establish permanent underground habitations. While ancient engineers clearly possessed impressive capabilities, skeptics argued there was a vast difference between creating underground spaces for temporary refuge, burial, or ceremony, and establishing truly permanent underground civilizations. The energy requirements for lighting, the need for fresh air, the difficulty of growing food without sunlight, and the psychological toll of never seeing the sun or stars all presented barriers that would have been extremely difficult for ancient peoples to overcome. The absence of clear evidence for the technologies and systems that would have been necessary to support underground civilizations suggested such civilizations never existed. The question of why ancient peoples would choose to live underground when the surface world offered far more favorable conditions also troubled skeptics. The conventional explanations for underground construction all involved specific limited purposes. Burial honored the dead while protecting remains, refuge provided temporary protection from enemies, religious ceremony connected with beliefs about the underworld as a sacred realm, and mining extracted valuable resources. None of these purposes required permanent habitation, and the massive investment of labour to create extensive underground cities would be difficult to justify unless surface conditions made living above ground genuinely impossible or intolerable. Theories that ancient underground civilizations emerged in response to catastrophic surface conditions like ice ages, flooding, or solar radiation face the problem that during most catastrophic events in human history, populations that survived did so by migrating to more favourable surface locations rather than by retreating underground. The underground option, while theoretically possible, was almost always going to be more difficult and less attractive than migration, suggesting that any ancient underground cities would have been temporary expedients rather than permanent civilizations. The lack of textual evidence from ancient civilizations describing their own underground cities also concerned skeptical scholars. The ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, and other literate civilizations produced extensive written records about their cities, their architecture, and their engineering projects. They described the buildings they constructed, the techniques they used, and the purposes their structures served. But if these civilizations had built extensive underground cities, we would expect their texts to mention such projects, to detail the engineering challenges overcome, and to explain the purposes the underground spaces served. While ancient texts mentioned underground chambers, tombs, and sacred spaces, they did not describe large-scale permanent underground urban settlements as part of ordinary life. The underground realms described in mythology and religious texts were explicitly presented as separate from the ordinary world, as places of the dead or gods rather than living human cities. Taking these mythological descriptions as evidence of real underground civilizations required reading the texts in ways the original authors did not intend, projecting modern desires to find hidden knowledge onto ancient writings that had different purposes and meanings in their original cultural contexts. Despite this skepticism, some mainstream scholars acknowledge that conventional archaeology might indeed have underestimated the extent of ancient underground development. The repeated discoveries of previously unknown tunnels, chambers, and even entire underground cities demonstrated that much remained hidden beneath already studied archaeological sites. The tendency of early archaeologists to focus on monumental above-ground architecture might have caused them to overlook or inadequately document underground features. Modern non-invasive survey technologies continue to detect anomalies beneath famous sites, suggesting that our understanding of ancient construction remained incomplete. A moderate position acknowledged that ancient peoples created more extensive underground developments than traditionally recognized, that major sites might have underground components that had not yet been discovered or fully explored, and that legends about underground passages might be based on real tunnel systems that have not yet been found or have been dismissed as natural caves. This position stopped short of accepting vast underground civilizations, but recognized that the topic deserved more serious investigation than it typically received, free from the polarization between true believers and dismissive skeptics. Around the world, numerous locations remained where legends, historical accounts, and preliminary investigations suggested significant underground structures might exist, waiting for proper exploration and documentation. In Tibet, persistent stories described extensive tunnel networks beneath monasteries, connecting sacred sites and extending deep into the Himalayas. The legends of Agartha and Shambhala, underground kingdoms of enlightened beings, were specific to this region, and while treated as myths by outsiders, were discussed as real places by some Tibetan teachers. The Chinese government's tight control over Tibet prevented independent archaeological investigation, leaving these legends unverified. Rumours occasionally surfaced of Chinese military encounters with unusual passages or chambers during construction projects in the region, but official confirmation never emerged. The Himalayas, the world's highest and most geologically active mountains, certainly contained extensive cave systems, and the region's long history of religious and cultural sophistication suggested that if significant underground development existed anywhere, Tibet would be a likely location. In the jungles of the Amazon, the vast, unexplored regions might harbour archaeological remains of sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations that the jungle had reclaimed. Recent LiDAR surveys that could penetrate the forest canopy revealed extensive earthworks and urban patterns beneath areas previously thought to be virgin rainforest, proving that large populations had once inhabited regions later abandoned. If these surface cities existed, logic suggested they might also have created underground developments, particularly for water management in the variable climate of the Amazon basin. Indigenous peoples in various parts of the Amazon preserved legends of underground cities and tunnels, sometimes describing them as the work of white-skinned ancestors or supernatural beings. The immensity of the Amazon rainforest, covering more than 2 million square miles, meant that systematic archaeological survey remained impossible, and discoveries depended largely on chance or on following up specific leads from indigenous informants. The probability that significant underground features existed somewhere in this vast region seemed high, even if their exact location and nature remained unknown. In North Africa, the Sahara Desert covered what had been fertile, populated land during the African humid period that ended around 5,000 years ago. Beneath the sand and stone of the current desert lay the remains of the rivers, and lakes, and settlements of this greener era. Satellite imagery revealed the courses of ancient rivers and the locations of former lake beds, and archaeological surveys in these areas discovered stone tools, pottery, and other evidence of substantial populations. The question arose whether these ancient Saharan peoples had created underground structures, perhaps for water storage or refuge from the heat that would still have been intense even in the greener climate. Desert peoples worldwide traditionally created underground shelters to escape midday heat, so the possibility that ancient Saharans did the same seemed reasonable. As the region dried and became increasingly uninhabitable, any underground chambers would have been abandoned and gradually buried beneath the advancing sands. The accidental discovery of one significant underground complex could fundamentally change understanding of pre-dynastic North African civilization, but the vast size of the Sahara and the difficulty of conducting surveys in such harsh territory meant most of the desert's secrets remained buried and undiscovered. In Europe, the network of underground tunnels known as Erdstalls in Bavaria and similar structures in other regions represented an archaeological mystery that mainstream archaeology had not satisfactorily explained. Hundreds of these passages had been documented, and surveys suggested thousands more existed undiscovered. The Erdstalls followed consistent construction patterns, including deliberately narrow sections that required crawling, chambers that sometimes dead-ended without apparent purpose, and curious features like storage niches and sitting benches carved into the walls. The conventional explanations that they were refuges or storage facilities failed to account for many of their features. Alternative researchers suggested they might be fragments of a once more extensive network, most of which had collapsed or been deliberately filled in, and that the portions remaining represented only a tiny fraction of an original system that connected settlements across large regions of medieval Europe. If true, this would suggest a level of coordination and purpose among medieval European communities that conventional history did not recognize, possibly indicating secret societies or religious movements that used the tunnels for purposes they wished to conceal from authorities. The possibility remained that the most significant underground structures lay not beneath known archaeological sites, but in remote locations that had never been properly surveyed. The logic that ancient peoples would build their most important structures in areas that later became major population centers might be flawed. If underground cities were built for refuge from surface catastrophes, or for religious purposes that required isolation, they might be located far from later settlements, in regions now considered remote and empty. The mountains of Central Asia, the Australian outback, the Arctic regions, and the deep interior of various continents might contain significant underground developments that had never been discovered because no one was looking in those areas. The challenge was that searching for underground structures in remote regions required substantial resources with little guarantee of finding anything, making it difficult to justify expeditions based on speculation. Most archaeological work focused on expanding known sites or following up on specific leads like local reports of unusual features. The systematic survey of remote regions for possible underground structures remained a task that no institution had undertaken, leaving vast areas of the planet's surface essentially uninvestigated. The persistent human fascination with underground worlds might reflect deeper psychological truths about consciousness and the human need for hidden knowledge and secret spaces. Psychologist Carl Jung described the concept of the shadow, the unconscious parts of the psyche that contained repressed desires, hidden talents, and aspects of the self that the conscious mind rejected or denied. Jung saw the descent into underground caverns in dreams and myths as symbolic of the journey into one's own unconscious, confronting the shadow and integrating its contents into conscious awareness. In this interpretation, the underground world was not literally beneath the earth, but rather beneath conscious awareness, and the treasures and dangers found in mythological underworlds represented the psychological riches and threats that existed in the depths of the human mind. The heroes who descended into the underworld and returned transformed were symbols of individuals who had undertaken the difficult work of self-examination and integration, emerging with greater wholeness and wisdom. The underground space in human psychology often represented the womb, the place of origin from which life emerged. The cave as womb symbol appeared in numerous cultures and contexts, from the Paleolithic cave paintings that some interpreted as representations of the mother goddess to the architectural design of temples as symbolic wombs where spiritual rebirth occurred. The descent into darkness followed by emergence into light paralleled the birth process itself, the journey from the enclosed unconscious world of the womb into the light of conscious existence. Initiation ceremonies that involved descent into caves or underground chambers reenacted this birth symbolism, allowing the initiate to experience death of the old self and rebirth into a new identity with expanded consciousness and capabilities. And the psychological power of these experiences helped explain why caves and underground spaces held such religious significance across cultures, because they provided environments that naturally evoked deep psychological archetypes related to death, birth, and transformation. The underground world also served as projection screen for social and political anxieties, the hidden place where threatening others might dwell, plotting against the surface world. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories often included elements of underground gatherings where malevolent plans were hatched in secret. Cold War anxieties manifested in fears of enemy tunnels and underground missile bases, invisible threats emerging from below. The popular culture trope of alien bases under the earth or government facilities where terrible experiments occurred tapped into paranoia about what those in power might be doing in secret, hidden from public view. The underground in these contexts represented the unconscious not of individuals but of societies, the hidden structures of power, the classified knowledge, the covert operations that shaped world events while ordinary people remained ignorant on the surface. Conspiracy theories about underground facilities and secret tunnels often revealed more about social mistrust and feelings of powerlessness than about actual underground construction, though this psychological dimension did not necessarily mean the underground features themselves were entirely fictional. The appeal of discovering hidden underground civilizations might also reflect a yearning for connection with something older and wiser than our current civilization, a desire to find validation that wisdom and advanced knowledge existed in the past that we could recover and learn from. In an era when many people felt disconnected from tradition and uncertain about the future, the idea of ancient underground civilizations preserving forgotten knowledge offered hope that solutions to contemporary problems might exist if we could only rediscover what was lost. This psychological need made people receptive to theories about advanced ancient civilizations, sometimes causing them to accept weak evidence and overlook logical problems with such theories. The desire for the theories to be true influenced how people evaluated evidence, creating confirmation bias where any anomaly or unusual feature became proof of the extraordinary claims, while contradictory evidence was dismissed or explained away. Skeptics often failed to recognize the psychological dimension underlying belief in underground civilizations, treating believers as simply ignorant or gullible rather than as people whose beliefs fulfilled important psychological needs for meaning, mystery, and connection to the past. The experience of actual exploration of underground caves and passages could profoundly affect explorers' psychological state and perception. The complete darkness of deep caves where no light penetrated, the silence broken only by the sound of water dripping or one's own breathing, the disorientation that came from losing normal spatial references, and the sense of isolation from the familiar surface world all contributed to altered states of consciousness. Explorers reported experiencing time distortion, heightened sensory awareness, hallucinations, and profound emotional responses during extended periods underground. These effects occurred not because of supernatural forces, but because of how the human brain responded to the unusual sensory environment of deep caves. For ancient peoples who entered caves without modern lighting equipment, who spent hours or days in darkness, and who interpreted their experiences through religious and mythological frameworks, the psychological effects of underground exploration would have been intense and would naturally have been understood as encounters with supernatural realms and beings. The underground world was literally a place where reality seemed different, where consciousness itself shifted, and where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual became permeable. Understanding this psychological dimension helped explain why caves held such power in ancient religion, and why the experience of underground spaces continued to fascinate and unsettle people in the present. In recent decades, new generations of researchers, adventurers, and enthusiasts had taken up the quest to investigate underground mysteries using modern technology and sometimes unconventional methods to search for evidence of ancient underground civilizations. Internet forums and social media allowed interested individuals to share information, coordinate investigations, and develop theories collectively, creating communities united by their fascination with the underground world. Some of these researchers operated entirely outside academic institutions, pursuing their investigations as personal quests, funded by their own resources or through crowdfunding from believers in their work. This independent research produced mixed results, with some investigators making genuine contributions by documenting previously unrecorded cave systems or anomalies, while others promoted sensational claims based on misinterpretation or fabrication. The absence of peer review and institutional oversight meant the quality of independent research varied enormously, making it difficult for outside observers to distinguish legitimate findings from fantasy. Some professional archaeologists and geologists, while maintaining skepticism about extraordinary claims, argued for a middle position that took seriously the evidence of extensive ancient underground construction without jumping to conclusions about vast hidden civilizations. This moderate approach focused on documenting and excavating known underground features, using modern technology to map suspected underground structures before excavation and following up on specific leads from historical texts and local traditions. The goal was to expand knowledge of ancient underground development through careful scientific investigation rather than through speculation and belief. This approach produced steady results, with new underground chambers and passages being discovered regularly at known archaeological sites, each discovery adding incrementally to understanding of ancient capabilities and practices. While these moderate researchers rarely found the spectacular underground cities that enthusiasts hoped for, their work demonstrated that the underground dimension of ancient civilizations remained incompletely explored and that significant discoveries remained possible. The improvement in exploration technology opened new possibilities for investigating underground spaces safely and efficiently. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with cameras and sensors could be sent into passages too dangerous or narrow for human explorers, mapping and documenting features that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Drones designed for cave exploration could fly through large chambers, creating detailed three-dimensional maps using LiDAR scanners. Fiber optic cameras could be inserted through small drill holes to visually inspect suspected chambers before committing to major excavation. These technologies reduced both the risk to human explorers and the cost of investigation, making it feasible to check multiple sites that previously would have been ignored due to the expense and danger of traditional exploration. As these technologies became more affordable and widespread, the probability increased that significant undiscovered underground features would be found, because more locations could be investigated more thoroughly than ever before. The legal and political challenges of underground exploration remained significant obstacles to investigation. In many countries, archaeological sites were protected by laws that restricted excavation to officially authorized projects, and obtaining authorization required navigating complex bureaucratic processes and meeting academic credibility standards that independent researchers struggled to achieve. In regions where political instability or conflict made access difficult or dangerous, known underground features remained unexplored because researchers could not safely reach them. The tension between the desire to explore and document underground mysteries and the legitimate need to protect archaeological sites from damage and looting created a difficult balance. Cases where enthusiastic but untrained explorers damaged fragile underground features or removed artifacts without proper documentation had made authorities cautious about granting access. The result was that many suspected underground structures remained off-limits to investigation, their secrets preserved not by ancient design but by modern regulations and politics. Despite these challenges, the quest to understand ancient underground development continued, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity, personal fascination, and the hope that major discoveries remained possible. Each generation contributed its own investigations and interpretations, gradually building a body of knowledge about how ancient peoples used underground spaces and what significance those spaces held in their cultures. Whether vast underground civilizations would ever be discovered remained uncertain, but the journey of exploration itself had value, revealing information about human history, ancient engineering, and the relationship between cultures and the earth beneath their feet. The underground world, whether mythical legacy or physical reality, continued to call to human imagination and curiosity, inviting each new generation to descend into the darkness and see what secrets might be revealed in the depths below. One of the most consistent features of underground legends and documented ancient underground sites was the presence of water, suggesting that access to underground water sources might have been a primary motivation for ancient underground development. In regions where surface water was scarce or unreliable, underground springs and aquifers provided stable sources of fresh water that could sustain populations even during droughts. The ancient city of Derinkuyu incorporated deep wells that reached underground water tables, ensuring the inhabitants could survive extended periods sealed underground. The Nabateans of Petra created elaborate systems for capturing and storing water, including underground cisterns and channels that collected runoff from rare desert rains, and directed it to storage facilities carved into the rock. The Roman aqueducts, famous for their above-ground arches, actually ran underground for most of their length, following the natural flow of water through carefully graded tunnels that maintained proper velocity and prevented stagnation. These examples demonstrated that ancient engineers understood underground hydrology and used that knowledge to create water systems that were often more sophisticated than their surface infrastructure. Underground rivers and lakes appeared prominently in ancient accounts of the underworld, suggesting that explorers of cave systems frequently encountered significant bodies of water in the depths. The Greek myths described the rivers Styx, Acheron, Lethe, and others flowing through Hades, and while these were mythologized, they likely reflected actual underground watercourses known to ancient Greeks. The cenotes of the Yucatan Peninsula, water-filled sinkholes that provided access to extensive underground river systems, were sacred to the Maya, who used them for ceremony and as sources of water. Modern cave divers exploring the cenotes discovered that many were connected by underwater passages, forming networks that stretched for miles beneath the jungle. The Maya would have known about these connections from observation of how objects or water levels in different cenotes responded to the same events, even if they could not have explored the underwater passages themselves. The sacred status of cenotes in Mayan religion reflected their practical importance as water sources and their mysterious nature as portals to the watery underworld. The concept of underground oceans captured imagination from ancient times to the present, with various legends describing vast bodies of water in deep caverns beneath the earth. Modern geology confirmed that water existed in enormous quantities beneath the surface, not as open oceans, but rather held in porous rock and in the molecular structure of minerals. In 2014, researchers discovered ringwoodite, a mineral that can contain water in its structure, at depths of 400 miles beneath the surface, suggesting the amount of water in the Earth's mantle might rival or exceed the volume of all surface oceans. This water was not in liquid form, but rather was chemically bound in minerals under extreme pressure and temperature. However, at shallower depths where pressure and temperature were less extreme, water could exist in liquid form in porous rock layers and in caves. The question arose whether ancient legends of underground oceans might reflect knowledge of particularly large underground lakes or flooded cave chambers that would have seemed like oceans to ancient explorers who encountered them. The practical importance of underground water for sustaining ancient cities was evident in how many famous ancient sites were positioned over aquifers or near caves that provided water access. Jerusalem's importance in ancient times owed much to its spring waters, accessed through tunnels carved into rock. The Pool of Siloam and Warren's Shaft were ancient engineering projects designed to ensure the city's water supply would remain accessible even during sieges when access to springs outside the walls would be cut off. The Tunnel of Hezekiah, carved through 1,750 feet of solid rock to bring water from the Gihon spring into the city, demonstrated both the critical importance of secure water access and the willingness of ancient peoples to undertake massive underground excavation projects to achieve it. If ancient engineers would carve third-mile-long water tunnels through solid rock, they clearly possessed the capability to create other extensive underground structures if they had sufficient motivation to do so. The connection between water and underground sacred spaces appeared in traditions worldwide, with holy wells, sacred springs, and water-filled caves serving as ritual sites. The waters that emerged from deep underground were often considered to have special properties, healing powers, or connections to divine forces. In Celtic traditions, wells were entrances to the other world, and offerings were made by dropping valuable items into their depths. In Shinto tradition, certain caves with water sources were considered dwelling places of kami, spirits that inhabited natural features, and the association between underground water and spiritual power might have originated from the mystery of water emerging from the earth, arriving from unknown depths as if sent by the gods themselves. For ancient peoples who did not understand the hydrological cycle, the appearance of springs seemed miraculous, water flowing from stone as if by magic. This sense of wonder invested underground water sources with sacred significance that made the cave systems containing them natural candidates for religious ceremony and for preservation as special places set apart from ordinary life. Beyond water, another practical motivation for ancient underground development was the mining of metals and minerals, an activity that created extensive tunnel systems in regions where valuable deposits existed. Ancient mines in Austria, Spain, England, and other parts of Europe penetrated deep into mountains, following veins of copper, tin, gold, and silver. The Hallstatt salt mine in Austria had been worked continuously for over 3,000 years, creating a vast underground complex of passages and chambers. The preservation conditions in the salt mine were so good that archaeologists discovered ancient tools, clothing, and even preserved bodies of miners from the Bronze Age, providing rare direct evidence of how ancient peoples worked underground. The scale of ancient mining operations often surprised modern observers who assumed ancient peoples with primitive tools could not have achieved such extensive excavation. However, the evidence showed that when the resource was valuable enough, ancient miners were willing to invest enormous labour over generations to extract it, creating underground workings that rivaled modern mines in extent if not in efficiency. The knowledge gained through mining would have equipped ancient peoples with practical experience in underground excavation, structural support, ventilation, and the other skills necessary for creating inhabitable underground spaces. Miners were experts in reading rock, in identifying stable formations and dangerous ones, in predicting where water might break through or where air would flow. This expertise was transferable to creating underground cities or tunnels for other purposes, and it seemed likely that the same communities that developed mining capabilities also applied that knowledge to create underground spaces for habitation, storage, or ceremony. The relationship between mining regions and legends of underground cities was notable, with some of the most persistent tales of subterranean civilizations occurring in areas that also had long histories of mining. Whether this represented actual ancient underground cities built by mining peoples, or whether it reflected the miners' familiarity with underground spaces causing them to elaborate and mythologize their experiences, remained unclear. But the correlation suggested some connection. The search for alchemical or magical substances provided another motivation for underground exploration in various esoteric traditions. Alchemists sought not just to transform lead into gold, but to find or create the philosopher's stone, a substance that granted immortality and ultimate wisdom. Various alchemical texts describe this stone as coming from deep within the earth, hidden in caves or mountains, accessible only to those who possessed the secret knowledge of where and how to search. While mainstream history dismissed alchemy as proto-chemistry mixed with mystical nonsense, some scholars argued that alchemical texts encoded real geographical and geological knowledge in symbolic language, and that the quest for the philosopher's stone was partly literal, a search for actual mineral or metallic substances found in specific underground locations. If this interpretation had merit, then alchemists and their predecessors might have explored extensively underground, seeking the caves and mines where the precious substances could be found, and their coded writings might contain actual descriptions of underground chambers and passages concealed beneath layers of symbolic language. The legendary treasures hidden in underground chambers drove much of the historical exploration of cave systems, with explorers hoping to find the hoards of gold and jewels that stories claimed existed in the depths. The treasure of the Templars, the Lost Dutchman's gold mine, the Seven Cities of Kubola, Oak Island's money pit, and countless other treasure legends involved something valuable hidden beneath the earth. While most treasure hunts ended in failure, occasionally significant finds did occur, validating the general principle that people did hide valuables underground and that some of these caches remained undiscovered. The practice of burying treasure in caves during times of danger was documented historically, and the failure of the person who hid the treasure to survive to retrieve it meant that some percentage of hidden treasures genuinely remained lost, waiting for lucky or persistent searchers. The treasure hunting motive, while often mocked as mere greed, did lead to extensive exploration of cave systems, and occasionally to significant archaeological discoveries when treasure hunters accidentally found something historically important, even if not monetarily valuable in the way they hoped. The gemstones and crystals formed in underground conditions held special fascination, partly for their beauty and value, but also for properties attributed to them in various traditions. Quartz crystals, formed in hydrothermal conditions deep underground, were considered by many cultures to have spiritual or magical properties, used for healing, scrying, or focusing mental energy. The enormous crystal cave discovered in Nacre, Mexico, containing selenite crystals up to 36 feet long and weighing 55 tons, demonstrated that extraordinary mineral formations could exist deep underground, in this case in caverns 800 feet below the surface. The Nacre cave was only habitable with protective equipment because of extreme heat and humidity, but it proved that underground chambers containing crystalline structures of breathtaking scale did exist. If ancient peoples discovered similar chambers in more accessible conditions, the impact on their culture and beliefs would have been profound, potentially giving rise to legends about underground palaces decorated with jewels and magical stones. The modern discovery of the Nacre caves suggested that other extraordinary underground chambers containing unique mineral formations might exist elsewhere, still unknown and waiting to be found. One explanation for why ancient peoples might have developed extensive underground facilities invoked catastrophism, the theory that Earth had experienced sudden devastating events in the past that made surface life temporarily impossible or extremely dangerous. If ancient civilizations faced catastrophic floods, ice ages, cometary impacts, or solar radiation events, going underground might have been the only option for survival. This catastrophe theory of underground development suggested that the vast systems of tunnels and chambers were not built for ordinary living, but rather as refuges during specific periods of crisis, and that the legends of underground civilizations reflected cultural memories of these survival periods when humanity retreated beneath the earth and waited for surface conditions to improve. The theory aligned with various ancient accounts of great floods, ages of darkness, and cosmic catastrophes that appeared in the mythologies of cultures worldwide, suggesting these might be distorted memories of actual events rather than pure imagination. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposed that around 12,800 years ago, one or more cometary fragments struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, triggering rapid climate change that ended the last ice age abruptly and caused mass extinctions. If such an impact occurred, particularly if it struck ice sheets causing catastrophic flooding, it would have devastated surface civilizations and might have driven survivors underground for protection. The myth of the Great Flood appeared in Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Chinese, and Native American traditions, among many others, suggesting a widespread catastrophic flood event in human prehistory. While mainstream geology attributed most flood myths to local events, or to the gradual sea level rise following the Ice Age, catastrophists argued that the consistency of the myths across distant cultures suggested a single global event that traumatized the survivors so profoundly that their descendants preserved the memory for thousands of years. If such a catastrophe did occur, the question arose where the survivors sheltered during the worst of the crisis, and underground refuges seemed like a logical answer. The theory of cyclic catastrophes suggested Earth faced regular devastating events, possibly related to astronomical cycles, that periodically forced civilizations to regress and rebuild. Some researchers pointed to the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle in Earth's axial orientation, as potentially correlating with catastrophic events when alignments with galactic features exposed Earth to unusual cosmic ray levels or other threats. Others suggested that the solar system periodically passed through regions of space containing more cometary debris, increasing the probability of impacts during certain eras. These cyclic catastrophe theories proposed that ancient peoples who had experienced such events, or who preserved knowledge from ancestors who had, built underground refuges as preparation for the next occurrence of the cycle. The mysterious astronomical knowledge possessed by various ancient cultures including their ability to calculate the precession cycle and their construction of monuments aligned to specific celestial events, might reflect this catastrophe preparation, with astronomical monitoring serving as an early warning system for when dangerous cosmic alignments were approaching. The legends of Atlantis, Lemuria, and other lost civilizations sometimes included elements of catastrophe driving people underground. Plato's account of Atlantis described the island civilization sinking into the sea in a single day and night of destruction, but alternative interpretations suggested that not all Atlanteans perished, that some escaped and brought their knowledge to other lands, or that they had established underground colonies before the surface catastrophe occurred. Helena Blavatsky's theosophical writings described root races that existed in previous ages, including the Lemurians, who purportedly lived millions of years ago, and who, according to her account, retreated underground when surface conditions changed, becoming a hidden race that continued to exist separate from surface humanity. While Blavatsky's writings were channeled rather than based on physical evidence, and were regarded by academics as fiction, they influenced generations of esoteric seekers and became incorporated into the mythology of underground civilizations. The question for serious researchers was whether these elaborate mystical narratives contained any kernels of truth about actual catastrophes and actual underground refugees that had been mythologized beyond recognition. The nuclear winter scenario from modern science provided a model for how catastrophic events could make underground survival necessary. Following a major volcanic eruption or asteroid impact, the injection of enormous amounts of dust and ash into the stratosphere would block sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet and photosynthesis to nearly halt for months or years. Surface life would face starvation as crops failed and food chains collapsed. Underground facilities with stored food and means of maintaining livable temperatures would offer the best chance of survival. If ancient peoples experienced such an event and survived through underground retreat, they would have learned the value of maintaining underground refuges for future emergencies. This logic suggested that civilizations might build and maintain extensive underground systems not for daily habitation, but as insurance against future catastrophes, keeping them stocked and ready while living normal lives on the surface. The underground cities would then be like massive bomb shelters, rarely used but always available, and if multiple catastrophes occurred over the course of ancient history, these facilities might have been used and reused by different generations of survivors. Parallel to legends of physical underground cities ran traditions about secret knowledge preserved and protected by hidden brotherhoods and mystery schools, knowledge that sometimes supposedly included the locations of underground chambers containing ancient texts and artifacts. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, and various other esoteric orders were rumoured to possess secret knowledge passed down from ancient times, including information about sacred sites and hidden repositories. While the actual secrets of these organizations, to the extent they had any, almost certainly bore little resemblance to the grandiose claims made about them, the persistent association between secret societies and hidden knowledge indicated a cultural belief that important information had been deliberately concealed from ordinary people and preserved only within initiated circles. The underground spaces in this context represented not just physical locations but metaphorical depths of knowledge, the hidden wisdom that lay beneath the surface of exoteric religion and public teaching. The Akashic Records concept from theosophical tradition described a cosmic library or database where all knowledge was stored, accessible to those who developed the psychic ability to read it. While the Akashic Records were usually described as existing in a spiritual or ethereal realm rather than in physical space, some accounts suggested physical repositories where sacred texts and artifacts were preserved, sometimes located underground in hidden chambers. Edgar Cayce's prophecies about the Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx represented this tradition, the idea that a library of ancient wisdom would be discovered containing the history and knowledge of previous civilizations. Whether such physical repositories existed or not, the concept served an important psychological and spiritual function, suggesting that the wisdom humanity needed for its problems already existed somewhere, preserved from an earlier, more enlightened age, waiting to be rediscovered and applied. The search for these repositories of knowledge drove certain researchers to pursue archaeological investigations with a fervour that went beyond mere academic curiosity, believing they were engaged in a sacred quest to recover humanity's lost heritage. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples sometimes described sacred knowledge that could only be passed down directly from teacher to student, never written and never shared with outsiders. Some of these traditions included information about sacred sites and underground spaces that had special significance. Among Australian Aboriginal peoples, certain caves and rock formations were known only to initiated men and could not be visited by women, children, or uninitiated individuals without violating sacred law. The knowledge of what these places contained and why they were important was carefully guarded and transmitted only within the proper context of initiation. When anthropologists or archaeologists tried to investigate these sacred sites, they often met resistance from indigenous communities who viewed such investigation as violation of sacred trust and potential contamination of spiritual power. The conflict between scientific desire to study and document these sites and indigenous rights to protect their sacred knowledge created difficult ethical and legal situations, but it also pointed to the reality that genuine secret knowledge about specific locations did exist in living cultural traditions, and was not simply the fantasy of conspiracy theorists. The concept of ancient libraries of lost knowledge captured public imagination through stories like the Library of Alexandria, the famous ancient repository that supposedly contained scrolls and books encompassing all the knowledge of the ancient world before its destruction by fire. While the historical Library of Alexandria did exist, and was significant, the legendary version that appeared in popular culture exceeded the reality. Suggested that the most important text from Alexandria had been secretly preserved, hidden away before the destruction, possibly moved to underground vaults for safekeeping. These hidden volumes supposedly contained advanced knowledge from earlier civilizations, scientific and spiritual wisdom that would revolutionize modern understanding if recovered. While no evidence supported the existence of such hidden collections, the desire to believe they existed reflected the hope that solutions to contemporary problems might be found in recovered ancient wisdom, rather than requiring humanity to develop entirely new knowledge through difficult trial and error. The Hermetic tradition of Western esotericism, and tracing its claimed lineage to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus of ancient Egypt, preserved texts and practices that were passed down secretly through generations of initiates. The Hermetic texts dealt with alchemy, astrology, theurgy, and other practices that mainstream Christianity considered heretical or demonic, so practitioners maintained secrecy to avoid persecution. These hidden teachings sometimes included references to sacred locations and underground chambers, where initiatory experiences occurred, or where important artifacts were kept. The construction of medieval cathedrals supposedly incorporated Hermetic principles, encoded in architecture, including the positioning of crypts and underground chambers in geometries that held esoteric significance. Whether these Hermetic traditions contained genuine ancient wisdom or were medieval inventions claiming false antiquity, they represented a living tradition of secret knowledge related to hidden underground spaces, a tradition that continued to influence esoteric seekers into the present day. While ancient underground development remained mysterious and controversial, the modern world had unquestionably created its own vast underground civilization, an infrastructure that future archaeologists would find as remarkable as we find Derinkuyu today. Modern cities contained extensive tunnel systems for subways and trains, for utilities including water, sewage, electricity and telecommunications, for vehicle traffic in some cases, and for pedestrian circulation. The London Underground, the New York Subway, the Paris Metro, and similar systems in hundreds of cities worldwide represented enormous investments in underground transportation infrastructure. Tokyo's underground was so complex that maps of different systems stacked in 3 dimensions showed a bewildering maze of passages at multiple levels, some for trains, some for pedestrians, some for vehicles, creating a shadow city beneath the surface that mirrored the complexity of the city above. Modern underground shopping malls, underground office buildings, underground parking, and underground storage facilities meant that significant portions of urban life now occurred below ground level, and this trend was expanding rather than contracting. Military and government facilities had gone underground on a massive scale during the Cold War, with both the United States and Soviet Union constructing enormous bunkers and command centers designed to survive nuclear war. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, and similar facilities in other countries represented substantial underground cities in their own right, with power generation, water supplies, air filtration, communication systems, and accommodations for personnel to remain underground for extended periods. The scale of these facilities was classified, but information that had been declassified suggested they included miles of tunnels and numerous chambers, essentially underground military bases. The construction techniques and technologies developed for these government facilities were then available for other underground projects, creating a modern expertise in underground engineering that paralleled the ancient expertise that we were trying to understand and reconstruct. Industrial facilities and infrastructure had also moved underground in many cases. Hydroelectric power stations carved into mountains, underground oil storage facilities, deep mines that had become cities in their own right, with their own infrastructure and communities, and research facilities like the Large Hadron Collider that required underground construction all demonstrated that modern civilization was as much underground as on the surface. The Swiss had become particularly adept at underground construction, tunnelling through the Alps for roads and railways, and creating national defence facilities in hollowed-out mountains. The psychology of the Swiss approach to underground development was interesting, combining practicality with a cultural preference for protecting valuable assets by placing them beneath stone. This same combination of practical need and cultural preference might have motivated ancient peoples to develop underground facilities more extensively than conventional archaeology recognized. Data centers, the physical infrastructure of the internet and cloud computing, increasingly were being located underground to provide physical security, temperature stability, and protection from electromagnetic interference. Abandoned mines, purpose-built underground facilities, and naturally occurring caves were being converted into data centers that housed the servers storing and processing the world's digital information. The irony that humanity's most advanced technology was being placed underground, in spaces not dissimilar from ancient caves, highlighted the continuing advantages that underground environments offered even in the modern era. The data center industry projected that a significant percentage of the world's data infrastructure would be underground within the next few decades, creating a vast digital underworld that would be critical to the functioning of surface civilization, but would remain invisible and unknown to most people who depended on it. The question of ancient underground development was not merely an academic curiosity about the past, but potentially held relevance for humanity's future. As surface conditions became more challenging through climate change, population pressure, and resource depletion, the option of moving portions of civilization underground might become increasingly attractive. Learning how ancient peoples created sustainable underground environments, what challenges they faced, and how they solved ventilation, illumination, and psychological problems could provide valuable lessons for modern underground development. The dismissal of ancient underground achievements as primitive or irrelevant might prevent us from learning from solutions that ancient engineers developed through experience and necessity. A more respectful approach that studied ancient underground sites as sophisticated engineering achievements could yield insights applicable to modern challenges, creating an unexpected bridge between ancient wisdom and future needs. The development of underground habitats for space exploration and colonization drew directly on experience with underground environments on Earth. Plans for bases on the Moon and Mars typically included significant underground components to provide radiation protection, temperature stability, and micrometeorite shielding. The psychological challenges of living underground in isolated environments with artificial life support closely parallel the challenges ancient peoples would have faced in extensive underground habitation. Research on how to maintain mental health and social cohesion in underground space habitats might benefit from examining how ancient cultures adapted to underground living, what cultural practices and social structures they developed to make underground life sustainable and meaningful rather than merely survivable. The cave paintings of Paleolithic peoples created deep in cave systems suggested that ancient humans living in caves invested energy in making those spaces beautiful and meaningful, decorating them with art that served social, spiritual, and possibly educational purposes. Future underground habitats might need similar attention to aesthetics and meaning if they were to be genuine homes rather than merely shelters. The environmental advantages of underground construction were increasingly recognized by modern architects and urban planners. Underground buildings required less energy for heating and cooling, because Earth provided natural insulation from temperature extremes. They preserved surface land for parks and agriculture, addressing the challenge of urbanization consuming valuable land. They protected against severe weather, including tornadoes and hurricanes. They reduced noise pollution and light pollution. These same advantages would have been apparent to ancient peoples, suggesting practical reasons for underground development beyond the mysterious or ritual purposes that conventional archaeology emphasized. A re-examination of ancient underground sites with attention to their environmental engineering could reveal sophisticated passive climate control, water management, and resource efficiency that matched or exceeded modern green building techniques, demonstrating that sustainable architecture was not a modern invention, but rather a rediscovery of ancient principles. The psychological relationship between humans and underground spaces remained incompletely understood despite modern research. Of these different reactions were unclear, while others found underground spaces comforting and womb-like. The causes of these different reactions were unclear, possibly involving a mix of genetic predisposition, early childhood experiences, and cultural conditioning. Understanding what made underground spaces psychologically acceptable, or even preferred by some individuals and groups, could inform both the design of future underground habitats and the interpretation of ancient underground development. If some ancient cultures or populations were more psychologically suited to underground living, perhaps through genetic factors or cultural training, they might have developed extensive underground civilizations while other groups remained firmly surface dwellers. This could explain why underground development appeared extensively in some regions and cultures, but not others, despite similar geological opportunities and technical capabilities. The integration of underground and surface spaces into unified systems represented a design challenge that both ancient peoples and modern engineers faced. A purely underground city would have significant disadvantages, including lack of natural light, limited food production, and psychological stress from permanent enclosure. A purely surface city was vulnerable to weather, conflict, and resource limitations. The optimal solution likely involved integrating underground and surface components, using each for what it did best. Ancient sites that modern archaeology had identified showed this integration, with surface structures for daily activities and agriculture combined with underground components for water storage, refuge, religious ceremony, and specialized activities. The sophisticated ancient cities might have been far more integrated underground surface systems than currently recognized, with extensive underground infrastructure supporting the more visible surface buildings, much like modern cities where underground utilities and transportation systems are essential to surface life but largely invisible, except to those who work in those systems. As our journey through the evidence, legends, and possibilities approaches its conclusion, we return to the question that began this exploration. What if the underground world is not merely myth but legacy, not fantasy but forgotten fact? The evidence examined over these many chapters does not provide a definitive answer, and perhaps that is appropriate. Mysteries should not be solved too easily or too completely, lest they lose the power to inspire wonder and continuing investigation. What the evidence does suggest is that human relationship with the underground world has been far more extensive, more sophisticated, and more significant than mainstream history has typically acknowledged. Ancient peoples did create remarkable underground chambers, passages, and cities that demonstrated engineering capabilities worthy of respect and study. They did invest enormous labor over generations in underground projects, suggesting these served important functions beyond simple utility. They did pass down legends and traditions about underground realms that, whatever their literal accuracy, reflected experiences and knowledge that ancient cultures considered important enough to preserve. The underground world, whether as physical reality or as psychological archetype, serves as a reminder of the depths beneath the surface of things, the hidden dimensions of reality that ordinary awareness does not perceive. In an age that often seems to value only what is visible, measurable, and immediately profitable, the underground world represents mystery, possibility, and the humbling recognition that we do not know everything, that vast spaces and unknown stories might exist beyond our current understanding. The impulse to dismiss as myth everything that has not been conclusively proven by modern science risks impoverishing human experience, cutting us off from dimensions of reality that ancient peoples engaged with directly through exploration, ritual, and incorporation into their worldviews. A more balanced approach acknowledges both the need for evidence and rigorous investigation, and the value of maintaining openness to possibilities that current paradigms struggle to accommodate. The search for truth about ancient underground civilizations continues, carried forward by researchers who range from careful academic archaeologists to passionate independent investigators, each contributing pieces to an incomplete puzzle. Future discoveries will certainly occur. Tunnels and chambers that have remained sealed and hidden for millennia will eventually be found and explored, and each discovery will add information that makes the picture slightly clearer or perhaps more complex. The probability that everything of significance has already been found seems vanishingly small given the vast areas of the planet that remain inadequately surveyed and the continuing discoveries at supposedly well-understood sites. The underground world keeps its secrets but occasionally releases them, revealing just enough to remind us that more remains hidden, waiting for those patient and fortunate enough to find it. The legacy of the underground world, whether understood as physical structures or as cultural knowledge and psychological archetype, reminds humanity of its connection to the earth, to the darkness from which consciousness emerges, and to the depths that lie beneath every surface. We live in a thin shell of atmosphere clinging to the surface of a planet whose interior remains largely unknown, despite our sophisticated technology and scientific knowledge. The deepest mine shaft or borehole penetrates less than 10 miles into a planet whose radius exceeds 4,000 miles. We have barely scratched the surface, and what lies deeper remains as mysterious as it was to our ancestors, who could only imagine the underworld and project onto it their fears and hopes. The underground world in this sense will always remain mysterious, always represent the unknown, always call to human curiosity to explore what lies hidden in the darkness below. As you drift now towards sleep, carrying with you the images and ideas from this long journey through underground mysteries, let your dreaming mind explore the caverns and passages that waking consciousness cannot visit. In dreams, all underground realms become accessible, all sealed chambers open, all hidden knowledge reveals itself to those who have the courage to descend into the depths of imagination and memory. The underground world exists in that space between waking and sleeping, between known and unknown, between history and mystery, and it is there, in that liminal realm, that truth and myth become indistinguishable, because both speak to realities that transcend the simple categories of fact and fiction. Sleep well, and may your dreams take you into the beautiful darkness beneath the world, where secrets wait patiently for their discovery, and where the ancient and future meet in the eternal present of the depths. The underground world, whether myth or legacy or both, remains beneath you now and always, a foundation and a mystery, a place of refuge and transformation, a reminder that beneath every surface lies depth, and that depth contains more than we have yet imagined. Rest now in the knowledge that the journey continues, that the quest for understanding never truly ends, and that the underground world will be here, beneath us, waiting, for as long as human curiosity persists, and as long as mysteries call to us from the darkness below.